All right, here we go. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're going to get started here in just a couple of minutes. We've got some people already kind of logging in, so we'll let that keep populating and go through all the boring intro stuff while, people aren't here yet. So, hi, Peter. How are you tonight?
I'm doing well. How are you, Jennifer?
Doing really good. Sitting here from Champaign tonight, and I think you're out at Lake of the Woods Forest Preserve. Is that right?
That's correct. Yep, out in Bahama.
Awesome. Yeah, nice. All right, so I'm going to go through a little bit of housekeeping and a little bit of this and that, and then we'll get ready to get started. So thank you again, everyone, for tuning in tonight. I'd like to begin by introducing myself. My name is Jennifer Wick, and I am the Public Program Specialist for the Champaign County Forest Preserve District, and I am based out of the Homer Lake Interpretive Center, which is located at Homer Lake Forest Preserve in Homer, Illinois, which is just about 15 miles east of Champaign-Urbana. And the Interpretive Center is currently open to the public Tuesday through Friday from 1 to 5 p.m. And we are still following current public health guidelines. And you can visit our Facebook page or website for more information about those specific guidelines. Homer Lake Forest Preserve is just one of 7 forest preserves in the Champaign County Forest Preserve District. And you can visit ccfpd.org for more information about where preserves are located and current open hours. Also, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram to stay up to date with what's happening. We're always posting really cool stuff, so definitely check us out. And tonight, we're so excited to be here with Peter Goodspeed, who is the Director of Natural Resources for the Champaign County Forest Preserve District. Peter has been with CCFPD for about 4 years, but before that, he received his master's in conservation ecology from the University of Michigan, and he's worked many natural resources jobs in the public and private sector. And in tonight's program, Peter will discuss using fire as a land management tool and kind of detail some of the district's current practices. If you have any questions during any time of this program, please feel free to drop them in the comments section and we will answer them at the end of the program. There'll also be time at the end of the program for question and answer. So without further ado, I will toss the ball over to you, Peter.
All right, sounds good. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here streaming this to you all this evening. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about prescribed burning tonight, as Jennifer mentioned. So here we go. The agenda today, we're going to talk a little bit about the goal of prescribed fire, kind of our burn units, how we break them down, when we burn and why, and then we'll cover different methods and how we accomplish our goals. So starting off, I just want to tell you a little bit more about myself. I've been the Director of Natural Resources here at CCFPD for about 1.5 years now. I've been in this department for 4 years. I've been an Illinois Certified Burn Manager for about 1 year. And I'm a Type 2 wildland firefighter, and I've had that cert for about 2 years. I've also conducted over 60 prescribed burns here at CCFPD. Just to let you know, I'm by no means an expert in this field. I'm still pretty green, still a lot more burning, a lot more experience I could get, a lot more trainings and seminars and workshops that I hope to attend in the future. And there are many prescribed burn managers out there with hundreds of burns under their belt. So I'll do my best to answer questions at the end and talk a little bit more about our program in detail. And just talking a little bit about the goal of this presentation, I want all of you to more or less, the next time you see an agency conducting a prescribed burn, to think a little bit more about the kind of planning that went into conducting a burn, what kind of objectives, what kind of goals that the agency is trying to accomplish with conducting these burns, and just thinking a little bit more about it other than just seeing someone off the side of the road and some roadside prairie lighting it on fire. So essentially, a prescribed burn is a planned fire or controlled burn that is used to meet certain management objectives. And when I talk about management objectives, prescribed burning is mainly used for 2 reasons. The first being fuel reduction, and that typically happens out west where agencies there's a lot of dead material in an area, and they go in and will do a controlled or prescribed burn to reduce the amount of fuel out west to mitigate wildfires and kind of mitigate risk in that capacity. So here at CCFPD, we don't really do fuel reduction with our prescribed burning. We do prescribed burning to meet natural resources objectives. And that being said, the goal of the Natural Resources Department here at CCFPD is to restore and maintain native, historically referenced biodiversity while meeting the recreational and educational needs of the public. When I talk about historically referenced biodiversity, we essentially go into these sites that were once in agriculture or our old field or some sort of land use, and it is our goal to essentially convert that site into what kind of ecosystem was there pre-European settlement. And as many of you know, in East Central Illinois, there was a lot of prairie. We are, in fact, in the Grand Prairie here in Champaign County. So a lot of grassland, a lot of tall grass prairie ecosystem, a lot of savanna ecosystem. And then our woodlands kind of hugged a lot of the rivers that flowing throughout Champaign County in more of the bottomlands. And fire actually shaped the landscape to a great degree. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And here on this slide, you can see our remnant cemetery prairie. We're doing a prescribed burn there. And we use that as a reference site. So we look at the plant community at this cemetery. And we kind of use that to guide us in our restoration efforts and what we want our prairies and our savannas to look like elsewhere. So why is fire good for the local ecosystems here in East Central Illinois? And I could do a whole presentation just about the benefits of fire, but the short answer really is that fire promotes the growth and diversity of the desirable plant communities, the plants that we want to be established here in our woodlands, savannas, and prairies. And fire is, in fact, a natural disturbance. Before there was fire suppression, pre-European settlement in this area, fire was infrequently caused by lightning strikes, and it was mainly fire was set deliberately by Native American tribes in this area nearly every year. And in fact, one of the earliest accounts of Native Americans putting fire on the landscape was in 1679 when LaSalle came through. LaSalle, the French explorer, came through Illinois, and one of his priests actually wrote in his journal, Louis Hennepin wrote about the Miami Indians setting fire to the prairie in November, December of 1679. And they would essentially use fire to herd groups of bison into one area and would leave a little opening and force them to exit through this opening where the Miami would kind of wait and ambush them. And so they used fire for to hunt bison. And in so doing, it promoted that grassland species, which was in turn more beneficial to bison. And then talking a little bit more about the benefits of fire. Fire, it removes the duff layer, allowing light to reach seedling plants or smaller plants that bloom earlier in the season. Fire speeds up decomposition, adding nutrients to the soil. It promotes seed germination. So the black burn surface of, say, a prairie, it will absorb more sunlight and warm up faster or earlier in the season, promoting seed germination. It kills invasive woody species or woody species or unwanted aggressive native woody species. So, you're typically your honeysuckle, your autumn olive that are getting into your grasslands. You want to control those. And then there are other native woody species that are more aggressive that aren't as resistant to fire, like your oaks, for example. Fire kills or sets back invasive herbaceous plant species, promotes a more balanced plant community of forbs and grasses, and promotes overall native plant diversity. So just a number of benefits. Talking a little bit more about the land holdings of CCFPD, the district manages about 4,000 acres. Of that, about 75% of that is managed as a natural area. So that's excluding water, mowed, day use areas. So that's about 3,000 acres that my department is responsible for managing. And then of that, about 1,325 acres gets burned at regular intervals. So we burn about a third of all of our land holdings at some point or another within intervals. I'll talk a little bit about what kind of intervals we use for each one. Here's a map. I really like this map. It's basically the historic land cover of the little section of Champaign County that includes all of our preserves. You can see how Lake of the Woods and Sangamon River kind of hug Sangamon River Forest Preserve. They kind of hug the Sangamon River here, River Bend, Soul Corridor, and how the woodlands were around these rivers. The rivers acted as natural fire breaks, preventing fire from moving across the landscape. You can even see the big grove here. This is where Champaign-Urbana is, and how the streams that flowed through Big Grove likely created this fire break, and where you can see there's more timber kind of inside this little protected area. You've got the Kickapoo Rail Trail, Homer Lake Forest Preserve, and then up here, the Middle Fork River Forest Preserve. So looking a little bit more deeper into our burn units, we have 70 different discrete burn units that we have different resource objectives for each one. Our smallest unit is about 1.2 acres, and our largest unit is 140 acres, and that's our Prairie View unit that's at our Middle Fork River Forest Preserve. One of the reasons we can burn such a large area all at once is because the Middle Fork River acts as a natural burn break here, natural control line. And then we have Sugar Creek coming up here, mowed areas to the north here. So yeah, when we burn this, we're able to send fire through it, even with a relatively small crew. And this is kind of what that looks like. I took this picture a few years ago when we burned it last, and I was standing right here just north of Willow Pond looking south. So you can really see how intense the smoke plume is going up into the air. And then looking at, on average, how many acres do we typically burn at once? And the average burn unit size is about 20 acres. How often do we burn? We burn our prairie units every 2 to 3 years, and our woodland units every 5 to 7 years. And in any good year, we burn between 500 and 800 acres, I would say. A lot of agencies like to brag about, that the number of acres that they got in a given season. And I think while acreage is a good metric, it's not always the best one, because even though this past season, for example, we didn't, put up 800 acres for the season, we were able to get some really high priority units, some woodlands that hadn't been burned in about 7 or 8 years that really needed it, and conditions were just right. So I wouldn't necessarily use acreage as a metric, but it certainly is a good way to kind of know if you're keeping on pace with what units need to get burned and how often they are burned. What time of year do we burn? We start our season in the spring. Usually we burn throughout the month of March and then into early April. However, I burn as early as late February. It kind of just depends on when the snow melts, when everything starts to dry up. And that's really dependent on how dry the fuel is. And then we typically end that mid-April. Past that, wildlife starts to become more active. So, the reptiles and amphibians, they start to come out of their hibernacula. And if they're in a prairie, for example, we don't want to set that on fire and end up killing wildlife. And then we burn in the fall. This season typically has a shorter window, and we'll start in late fall. After we have a good killing frost, about 2 weeks after that. This typically happens in November. And then our fall season ends when it rains or snows, and it really, the fuel just isn't dry, isn't conducive to burning. And one might ask, what time of year is best, fall or spring? And I will say that really depends on our management objectives. And I'm not going to go through everything, but our typically spring is better just because it's a longer season. The days are longer. We can be more flexible with what we get done. But there certainly are pros and cons to both spring and fall burns. For example, a lot of our fall burns I've found they're more effective at killing woody vegetation that we don't want in our prairies, for example. And I think that's because the fuel, it burns hotter. There's more resonance heat kind of working slowly through these prairies. It gets a lot hotter depending on the species of the woody species that we're going after. It could still have its energy above ground. So that seems to be more effective. But there are just plenty of other reasons why we burn, when we burn. So this kind of goes over that. Yeah, as far as planning for our burns, I write a burn plan for each management unit. And for burns to be legal, we basically have to plan a burn and then burn our plan. And each unit conditions have to be met to be within prescription. And when I talk about being within prescription, I'm talking about conditions such as wind speed, wind direction, relative humidity, all those factors we take into consideration. And we put a lot of thought into each one of our burn plans for all 70 of our discrete burn units. And then we're constantly looking at the weather forecast. Usually 7 days out, I have an app on my phone that will show me forecasted relative humidity, wind speed, wind direction. That gives me a rough idea of what the weather models are telling me. About 2 days out, we'll get fire weather forecast generated by the National Weather Service. Those are a little bit more accurate. Those touch on kind of smoke dispersal, vent rate, so how quickly the smoke will kind of, move up from a site and disperse. And then the day of the burn, we rely on our spot weather forecast. So that's essentially a pin we drop for the Lincoln office of the National Weather Service, and they will generate a custom forecast for us. I've been in close contact with the meteorologists there before. They've even called me on my cell phone and be like, hey, just to let you know, it's going to be windier and drier, this afternoon. Just want to make sure. So usually everything is still within prescription. And then we're constantly monitoring wind speed, wind direction, and relative humidity in the field as we're conducting these burns. So kind of transitioning, I want to talk a little bit more about methodology, how we get these burns done, some of the tools we use, how we emphasize safety and planning. And I think these are, I've got a couple videos here. So here's one of our technicians. He's holding what's called a drip torch. So this is what we use for ignition. As you can see, he's lighting, there's a wick at the end of it, and then there's a downspout that essentially pours fuel over the wick. And that's kind of how we ignite our burn units. The mixture we use in our drip torches is a 3-to-1 ratio of diesel and gasoline. And then here's a hand tool that one of my technicians is using. He's within our control line here, which is a mowed trail. And we've essentially lit one side of that to create a black line, and we'll talk about this later. And he's using what's called a flapper, which is essentially used to smother the flame and prevent it from creeping along the dead grass, kind of preventing it from getting into this unit over here that we do not want to burn. So that's just a hand tool we usually use in our grassland prescribed burns. So for our woodland burns, we use leaf blowers, leaf rakes. Woodland burns, our breaks aren't as intense just because the fire isn't as intense and creeps slowly. And so usually our woodland breaks are 2 to 3 feet of bare dirt. I mean, once this fire kind of backs into this break here, it's gonna just go out, burn up all the leaf litter and go out. And then I would argue our most vital tool is our Polaris UTV with a 50-gallon water tank on the back and pump. And I'm usually in the UTV kind of patrolling our control line, making sure nothing jumps over, looking for spot fires, making sure there's no fire in a unit where it shouldn't be. So we constantly have water. We have water in our UTV and in our dump truck as well as backup. So before I talk to you about our typical ignition plan, I want to discuss fire behavior. So as I'm sure many of you know, for combustion to happen, you need oxygen, heat, and fuel for combustion to occur. In this top example, this is what we call a head fire, where you essentially have wind pushing fire into the fuel. This fire is preheating that fuel, and it is essentially out of control when there's a head fire. So there's very little one can do to prevent a head fire from moving forward and proceeding through the fuel. But what we do in our prescribed burning is we do a lot of backing fire ignition, where we'll essentially intentionally we'll create a control line over here, and then we light a fire to kind of back against the wind into the fuel, and we have a lot better control of that. And so this is our one of our units at our Point Pleasant Prairie, which is up at our Middle Fork River Forest Reserve. We burned this last spring, and our control lines were essentially mowed trails. We use those as brakes. There was a tile that was installed here, and there was no fuel here last spring. We figured, well, this would be a great opportunity to use this as a fire break. And then up here, as you can see, there is an agricultural field. I'm pretty sure it was corn stubble at the time we burned this. And you can see here the wind was coming from the south. So we started ignition in this corner, and I had one ignition crew kind of move along this trail up to this corner, and that consisted of someone with a drip torch, hand tools, water. And this individual created a black line here where we're essentially widening our control line by creating an area that doesn't have any unburned fuel in it. So as I mentioned when I talked about fire behavior, this flame is just slowly backing against the wind into the fuel here. And then I had another ignition crew light the flank over on this side here. So once each crew reached these corners and there was enough black line on the downwind side of the burn here, they ended up moving into the middle of this unit, lighting the head fire. So remember I said, basically once you light the head fire, you lose control of the fire because the wind is pushing it and into the fuel. It's preheating the fuel and moving through. However, because we established our control lines when we created wide enough black lines, this will essentially burn into itself and go out. And this is what that looked like. So as you can see in this video, I'm not going to play the whole video over, but you can kind of see in the distance all these little flames out here, some smoke down here. So this is an area where we have a black line. It's widening our control line. And then once both ignition crews got to each corner, you can see we've got water over here. Got another technician with a hand tool over here. I think there's water right there. At that point, kind of closed the ring and yeah, I ended up lighting the head fire there. So I get a lot of questions about concerns for wildlife, burning up wildlife that are within habitat units. And essentially we leave a patchwork of unburned habitat for wildlife. So for example, here's our buffalo trace prairie. And you can see 3 units that were burned last fall in yellow here. And then 4 units that we burned this spring in red. And then all of the units in green are prairie restorations, are burn units that are part of that group of management units that we consistently burn. And some of these we strategically did not burn for that very reason, to keep refuge intact for wildlife to escape into. And so yeah, we do think about wildlife a lot in planning these burns. Over here on the right, for example, this was at Sangamon River Forest Preserve. And this whole prairie unit, since this restoration began, I think this whole unit was burned all at once consistently. And last spring or last fall, we thought it might be nice to break it up. So what we did, there's a trail that kind of goes through this prairie unit. We decided, well, why don't we just burn half of it? We'll use the trail as a control line. And it ended up going great. And this is a cool drone picture we took a couple weeks after of the unit. And then we also, ring fires aren't really the best for wildlife because your wildlife that remain in the middle kind of get trapped there and the fire moves in around them. But what we'll do is instead of ringing a unit completely, we'll stop and we'll leave a little opening. And if we have a lot of time on our hands, we'll stand there and we'll wait. We'll try to stay away from the opening in case any wildlife are coming out and see us. We don't want them turning around going back in. And yeah, we've seen a number of little rodents and things like that coming out. A lot of birds we'll see flying out of the unit. So we really do our best to try to ensure that we're not just burning up all of the animals that exist within these units. And as I mentioned before, we typically, when we're burning in the spring, we don't like to burn late into April. For a lot of the amphibians and reptiles that are starting to come out of the ground. Yeah, so I think we're kind of coming to a close here, but I just want to end by saying that prescribed fire is a vital tool. It recreates natural disturbance on the landscape per European settlement. It's economical. It's a low maintenance way of achieving management goals. It promotes native biodiversity. And hopefully the next time you see an agency conducting a prescribed burn, think a little bit more about, what are the weather conditions like? Where's the wind coming from? Is it really dry out? Is it a woodland or grassland burn? Just think a little bit about these individuals. They're not just putting fire on the landscape just to do it. They're putting fire on the landscape with a goal in mind. And a lot of thought goes into these management plans and how we decide to burn, what units we burn. And there's really nothing more gratifying than going into an ecological management unit and doing a prescribed burn on it and really seeing it respond the way that we planned it to and the way that we really wanted it to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. And I'll say I participated in helping with the prescribed burn one time. I did not take part in any of the fire burning because I'm not qualified for that. I had the flapper, and let me just say it is not an easy thing to be a part of. It's very hot. You have to wear all that protective gear as well. And it's very smoky. So you guys really are out there doing some of the hard, you say that it's a low maintenance, job, but that we can see how much goes into what you do and everything that takes into planning for it. So it's really an incredible thing. And it looks like is this at Middle Fork Forest Preserve right now, this video?
Yeah, it is. I just kind of left this up here for questions, but yeah, this was like a smoke whirl that I think I was flying the drone. I'm actually down here flying the drone, and I wanted to get some cool pics of the head fire. And then I turned around and saw this, and this was a little bit more interesting. You don't see something like this every day.
Awesome. Cool. So for everyone who's still watching, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. We'll stay on here for as long as questions are coming through. And we do have some questions already that have come through the comments on our Facebook and YouTube. And it looks like some of this we kind of touched on during the presentation, but we'll go ahead and just make sure that we reviewed everything. So it looks like Doug Foster here had a question about what you refer to. You refer to fuel a lot in your presentation, and he's asking you're calling the dead material fuel, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And sorry, I didn't specify that earlier, but yes, fuel is kind of the dead duff of the dormant or dead plant species, and that's what we're burning. That's what we're burning off.
And that's what, like, you talked a lot about how when there's a lot of that, it's helpful to help the burn progress and whatnot, right? But you also talked about a different kind of fuel, which is what you use in your drip torches. So there's two kinds of fuels kind of involved in prescribed fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Nice. All right. So we talked a little bit about this next one about you did talk quite extensively about wildlife and how you take that into consideration when you are burning a unit, and how you try to avoid nesting times and you try to allow plenty of escape routes for animals that may be around. But is there anything else that you'd like to plug in about some factors that you consider when there are wildlife in an area that you're burning?
Yeah, so some of the early season frog species, to be honest, there are a lot of units that we burn that will have kind of habitat that you typically find these species in are standing water. And when we light up a prairie, no vegetative material in that standing water, really, it just gets too wet and the fire will be moving along and it'll just go out. And we actually saw that. We burned up at Middle Fork this past spring, and we saw that at Point Pleasant. There was this little shallow water wetland, the fire went through and it kind of just burned around and left the wet vegetation around the edge of the wetland, and then obviously didn't carry into standing water.
Mhm. Yes, I think that's an important thing to note. And another thing to note is that these fires, they progress kind of slowly too. And so, there's plenty of time, I think, when you guys are doing this for animals to kind of sense that, oh, I need to get out of this area maybe, and actually leave the area before they get into a sticky situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, that was a good question.
When we light a backing fire too, I mean, if I had all the time in the world and we only had a handful of units to burn every season, I would just light a backing fire and I wouldn't even light the head fire and just let it slowly back in through the unit. It gives plenty of room for wildlife to escape and whatnot. And there are some units that we really like it to just kind of creep through slowly back through. You get complete combustion of the fuel. But yeah, I mean, when we're kind of rushing to get, maybe we have a small window left and we're trying to get as many acres burned, given a small window, we'll maybe let it back halfway through the unit, then light the head fire, wait a little bit, leave an opening, and then we'll end up closing it off.
Yes. Awesome. So let's see what else we got here for questions. Looks like people like your fire map and were interested in watching the videos that you showed us of your staff at work. That was really, really interesting to see as well too. And it's also, something that to watch in action is really, really interesting, and it's a little bit scary. You think, you see this and you're like, oh, it's, not a big deal, but when you think about it, you're, setting acres on fire, and that is quite a task. So I've seen some of the other things that you guys have done to help keep things that you don't want to burn from burning. So talking about all of the fire breaks that you use and whatnot, I think is something that maybe a lot of people don't realize, that things that are used as natural fire breaks, and fire just doesn't go over those areas because you're making sure that conditions are just right for that. So I think that was an important thing to share as well.
Yeah, and something else kind of related to that, I forgot to mention. I think I talked a little bit about how we use leaf blowers and rakes for our woodland burns. We really like dead standing trees, and we like to maintain them for cavity nesting birds and other wildlife that really take advantage of these dead trees. And there are plenty of woodland burns where we'll go in and we'll prep the site and we'll find every dead tree in the site, and we'll leaf blow or rake around it so the fire will kind of burn up to it, and then it'll hit bare dirt before it burns up into the tree, because we really like to maintain those for wildlife.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. So another thing that I wanted to kind of ask about, that maybe some people, you mentioned a little bit about how one of the reasons that there's like two kind of reasons that you burn. One is to help control invasive species, and one is to help promote the growth of the native species. So can you talk a little bit more maybe about, you talked about some of the woody invasive species that you like to control, which you mentioned the honeysuckle, I believe, is one that you mentioned that really responds to being burned over well. But what are some other invasive species that you have seen success in using fire to help kind of cut those back?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, in our woodlands, some nasty herbaceous biennials like garlic mustard, for example. Garlic mustard does not like fire at all, especially when it's in kind of developing in its first year rosette. If its first year rosettes are popping up and we send fire and burn all the leaf litter around it, it'll end up killing the plant, which is really good. A lot of cool season grasses, smooth brome, depending on if it's late enough. That's one of those where if you burn it kind of late spring, you can really set back and control smooth brome. But you also have a trade-off there where the later in the spring you burn for cool season grasses, for example, you're also going to set back the native forms that you kind of want to be established. So really depends on what if you want your site to be nothing but warm season grasses, then I'd say go for it. But we also like to have that nice balance of wildflowers as well.
Mhm. Yeah, it's incredible to think about how much really goes into all of this planning, and it never ceases to amaze me to hear about that. So, on the other side of things, what are some examples of some native species that benefit from fire and respond really well to being, having that cycle every so often?
Yeah, so there are a number of forb species. I think there was a study that was recently published. I think it was in the New York Times. The echinaceas really like fire, so
Mm, okay, cool.
pale purple cone flower. Um, and if you go through a site, after we've burned, and you just kind of see a lot of these wildflowers are just taken off.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot. And anyone who visits the preserves, you'll notice too when, you can tell when a unit has been burned because it's black usually, and sometimes it's a little smoky for a day or two afterwards, depending on weather conditions. But within just, it seems like a week or two almost sometimes of getting that burn, if the weather is warm and if it's nice, you can just see everything start greening up right away. And it's a really validating thing to see. I mean, and I don't even do it, so I can't imagine how it goes for, your staff who are out there putting in the hard work every day.
Yeah,
Awesome.
absolutely, and it can look a little devastating too after a burn. But I also I think about how grasslands, prairie ecosystems, most of these organisms, most of the organism is actually underground,
Hmm.
where they're putting most of their biomasses and their roots going into the soil. So, what's kind of burned off the top, that's not really touching these perennials. These perennials are putting their roots deep into the ground. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I have one more question, Peter, and then I'll kind of be quiet and let other people continue to chime in if you have more questions. We are set to be on here until 7:30, but we'll kind of hang out. If we're getting questions until then, we'll stay until then. But if things start to taper off a little bit, we'll kind of wrap it up. But my last question is, I don't know if it's possible, but can you name maybe an area within the Forest Preserve District that you've seen noticeable positive changes that are really responding well to fire and burning that you've been able to do over just the years that you've been involved with it, which might be kind of hard to know because you say you don't burn it every year, but what is an example, like if people want to go out and see one of these sites that is a really high quality prairie or woodland that has a lot of native species and not so much invasive because of the management that you've done, what would be somewhere that would be really good to go?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say the main prairie at Sangamon River Forest Preserve right now,
Yeah.
just because that site. I'm trying to think when that was planted. I think that was planted about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe. It's relatively young, but it's still. I mean, you go out there and it's super super diverse. There are a ton of wildflowers, ton of forb species. And that's a site that we have consistently burned, I think, every 2 years now. And especially since this is the first year where we have broken it up and kind of cut the site in half and burned half of it, I really encourage, if you can get up to Sangamon River Forest Preserve, to go check it out, because you'll really be able to see the difference not only in the duff layer that's built up in the half that wasn't burned, but also how that prairie was planted. It was prepped at the same time, planted at the same time, and for the last several years it was burned in the same regiment, but burning half of it now, you'll really be able to observe the changes in plant community, one side versus the other.
Nice. Yeah.
So yeah, that'll be really cool to see.
Yeah.
This year.
That would probably be the same thing I would say would be the like Sangamon River is a really great prairie site to see. I also really love the prairie at Middle Fork Forest Preserve. It's always looking really beautiful there. And the nice thing about summer is that we are slowly getting closer to the season when we're going to start seeing some of these things. Plants are starting to come up, things are starting to bloom, and it's just going to be an endless show for the next couple of few months. That's what all this rain is so good for. So if you've been miserable because of the rain, just think about how valuable it is to our prairie species that need that to spur them into growing. So at this point, Peter, I think I'll go ahead and I will wrap things up. We can stick around for a little bit longer in case people have questions coming into the comments. But I just want to thank everyone for watching tonight, whether you're watching this live or whether you're watching it later. Thank you so much for taking the time. And again, we hope that this helped maybe answer some questions that you've had about why the Forest Preserve District and other agencies use prescribed fire as a management tool, and helps to answer some of those burning questions that you might have had about why we do this. So just so you all know, this will be available for viewing later. So it's going to be right here on this Facebook page for viewing indefinitely. It's not going to go anywhere. And it's also going to be available on our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again, revisit any of that at any time, you are welcome to do that. And if you have questions that come up that you didn't think of while you were watching this live, you can leave them in the comments and we will address them. We'll be able to see that the questions are coming in there as well. And I think that the last thing that I want to say is that I hope that everyone gets a chance to enjoy some dry weather here soon. And we hope to see you at one of the preserves sometime soon. And thank you everyone for being here, and have a great night. It's so weird because usually we have people that can say, good night. We don't have video right now. But yeah. I think, Peter, let's give it just a minute or two, maybe, and we'll see if any more questions come in. And then we can call it a wrap.
Sounds
good.
I'm
really interested. I actually want to go back through this myself and look at some of those videos and maps again, because those were really interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. What I wish we had, if we just had more staff on some of these burns, it would be nice if we could have just one person flying the drone the whole time, getting footage. So
yeah, that's really cool to be able to see with the drone for sure.
Yeah, and I want to go send it up too and get that same picture of Sangamon River kind of side by side to see how one half is responding.
Awesome. And I think I'll say too, for anyone who might still be watching, is that our Natural Resources Department offers a lot of volunteer opportunities. If you want to be involved in, I don't think you use volunteers to help with burns usually. Maybe you have some people with that, I don't know. But for planting and for invasive species management and removal, and you can check our website and our Facebook page for information about those. And I think you guys had one today to do some planting, and you have maybe some coming up, I think, also later this week. So we'll be doing some more planting. So
yeah, we're planting tomorrow morning at I think 8:30 on the peninsula at Lake of the Woods. Anyone's welcome to come. And then at our River Bend Forest Preserve, we'll be planting 1,500 bare root seedling trees, and that's next Tuesday, I believe.
Nice. Yeah, so definitely check our website, ccfpd.org, or our Facebook page, which is the CCFPD Facebook page, and you'll be sure to see more information about all of that. All right. Well, I think, Peter, we should go ahead and call it a night and say thank you again to everyone who watched, and we look forward to seeing you soon sometime.
All right. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Yeah.